Hi, and welcome to my webinar today, where I'm going to be talking about working memory difficulties in primary school. I'm going to whiz through some key information about what working memory difficulties look like in the primary school, and then some very practical steps that you can take. So we're going to be looking at, very briefly, the signs of working memory difficulties, a little bit about what research says, and then some practical strategies to support children in school, and a tiny bit about support at home so that you can advise parents. So working memory difficulties, for those who don't realise, is the common difficulty that affects nearly all students who've got learning differences. So students with dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD and autism all will have working memory difficulties. But I find in my experience, a lot of people misunderstand what working memory difficulties actually mean. So I like this cartoon. I think it illustrates it quite well. And it's probably one of the main signs of working memory difficulties. So the teacher's talking and the student with working memory difficulties really has no idea what is being talked about. So we use working memory a lot, particularly, I would argue, in primary school. We need it to listen to instructions. If we're doing some writing, we need it to remember what we want to write while we're writing it down. If we're reading a sentence, it helps us to remember what we've read. It helps us sequence within an activity and remember all the steps that we need to do. And then, quite fundamentally, it also helps us to remember key information. If you have difficulties working memory, it makes it very, very hard to remember things like number facts, times tables, and spellings. And also, we use our working memory to help us to store things long term, because we process the information in our working memory and then we work out where we need to store it, what it links to, where it should go. If you can't keep something in your mind for very long, then you're not able to process it, and therefore the information will be lost and it won't be stored long term. So here are some really early signs, and to be honest, you can tell if a child has working memory difficulties quite early on. I would argue right from preschool. So these are the children who find it hard to remember simple rhymes and nursery rhymes. You know, you sing them together, you say them together, and then they just simply can't remember how it goes. They often seem to misunderstand or forget what you said. So you ask them to do something, and then the next moment they're like, what did you say? What have I got to do? And it can also affect what we call word finding difficulties. So it means it's very hard to bring the specific word to mind. So when they're talking about things, they might use the word thingy or it, and then they point a lot to things rather than actually using a specific word. You might find that they lose things quite easily. I know we all lose things from time to time, but these are the children who just seem to be quite forgetful and quite disorganized. And they can seem very distracted, because if you have a poor working memory, it actually makes it very hard to sustain your focus and follow what someone is saying. As students get older, as I would argue, the signs become more and more obvious and easier to spot. So you're not able to learn things literally by heart, because you can't process the information sufficiently to make any sense of it. It can make learning new vocabulary very difficult. So often these are the students who can't seem to remember the names of the shapes. They might not even remember the names of all the colours. It's some of those very basic things, as well as more difficult vocabulary as you move through the primary school. They will often seem to have forgotten what you've done the day before. It'll almost be like they weren't there. And they might have, that's where people get confused. They might have followed the lesson really well, and you might think, oh, they really understand this. And then you find the next day it's as if they never done it. Or it takes them a long time to tune back in to what you're talking about. They might very often get lost within doing a task. They start doing something and then they seem to get distracted and they forget what they're doing. It can also make it really hard to actually start a task, partly because sometimes they just simply can't remember what they've been asked to do. Also, as I say, it does cause working memory difficulties, actually do cause distraction. So they might, kind of get distracted by something else and then not really get started. And it can also make it very hard to actually finish a task because, again, as you're working through it, you kind of forget what you were actually in the middle doing, or you forget your idea. And again, these are students who often leave their belongings all over the place, or they might have something in their bag they were meant to give to the teacher and they simply forget to give it to the teacher. The signs change as students get older. So as you go into more reading and writing tasks, these are the students who miss out words in their sentences and don't realise they've missed out something. They very often won't punctuate correctly, and it's not necessarily that they don't understand what a sentence is or capital letters and full stops. They simply can't keep a whole sentence in their head in order to be able to correctly punctuate. They often lose their place when they're reading, and they will forget things from page to page. Particularly noticeable when they're first learning to read. You know, they might sound out a word on one page, cat, and then they come across that word on the next page, and they have no recollection that they've seen it before. They might not remember the storyline properly either. It can make mental calculations very difficult, even quite simple ones. 3 add 7, for example. I know that's a number bond, but they simply might not be able to keep the two numbers in their head to even work out what to do. So they often, as I say, will seem distracted, and people tend to complain because they're like, oh, well, they weren't trying to listen. No wonder they don't know what to do. They seem so distracted. But actually, if you've got a poor working memory, it does actually make it very hard to focus because you're not able to follow things for a very long time. A lot of the information is lost, and so it doesn't really make sense. And it can actually make, and I find this, I am an adult with working memory difficulties, it makes it very hard to follow a conversation. As more people are talking, you lose track of what's being said. And crucially, you very often lose track just at the moment where someone asks you or someone tells you a joke and you've got no idea what they're talking about. And in the classroom, the most telltale sign of working memory difficulties is the student who doesn't know what to do. Even though you've shown everyone, you've explained it step by step, you've said it as clearly as you possibly can imagine, they're the one, as you say, off you go. What do I do, miss? Which is extremely irritating, but in reality is something they actually can't control. So this is quite an important bit, the working memory misunderstandings. I think many teachers have the idea that working memory can be improved just by effort. So if you tried a bit harder, you would be able to listen. But in reality, working memory is finite for each student. And if your working memory is 3 seconds, 5 seconds, then if the information is longer than that, you simply can't remember it. It's not lack of effort. You could try as hard as you wanted. The only time you can remember something that is longer than that is when it's very meaningful. And then if it's very meaningful, you're actually not using your working memory at all. You might be using your episodic memory or your semantic memory. And that's why it can be quite confusing because these students, they might not be able to remember something simple like 4 plus 6 equals 10 or how to spell the word the, and yet they can tell you on the subject they're interested in, they can tell you multiple facts And that becomes very confusing to a lot of people. And then they feel like the person's being lazy. So unfortunately, with working memory, it can't be improved. There are all these computerized schemes which are advertised, but research has shown that though that might improve the memory within that specific task, it doesn't have the carryover effect into the classroom. So working memory improves with age, but if you have a weak working memory, it will improve very gradually and it will remain weak for your age group. Um, as I say, the lack of focus is actually part of the problem. And I know, I mean, I used to work with someone who used to always say, oh, that child's their own worst enemy. If only they would listen more carefully, if only they were more focused, not realizing that actually by having working memory difficulties, you can't focus better. That is part of the problem. And also, it's quite upsetting sometimes for children who are actually quite bright when it appears that they don't really understand things because they weren't able to follow what you were saying. So there's been a lot of research. It makes it quite clear that working memory has a huge impact, particularly on the early years of education. And one of the key findings has been that teachers don't often identify children who've got working memory difficulties with having a memory difficulty. They talk about not listening and being distracted without really realizing what it really means to have working memory difficulties. And more recent research has also shown that actually one of the biggest indicators of success in school is your working memory. So not so much your kind of academic ability, as we call it, which can mean that some very bright students actually underachieve in school because they have weak working memory, and people are not accounting for that in the way that they teach or the way that information is presented. So one of the key things that you can do is just to change your mindset. The teacher does set the tone of the classroom, and just rethinking and maybe considering that these students who never seem to know what they're doing, seem very slow to get started, are actually doing their best. They're not being difficult or lazy. It's not that they're not very bright. And just understanding that these students can't control how much they are able to listen to and remember at a time. And then that's quite distressing. I think people don't often realise it's actually quite distressing for the child, because as well as being told off by the teacher, like, why didn't you listen? I've just told you that. They're berating themselves of like, why don't I know what to do? Everyone else knows what to do. What's wrong with me? And so you've got this internal conflict, and then the teacher and often the parent being very disappointed in the child as well. And that can be very hard to deal with. So try and focus on the things that you know that they do well. And also try and be proactive in thinking how much working memory is required in this task. What can I do to reduce the amount of working memory load? What can I do to make it more accessible? Because we know who these children are who are going to struggle, and yet we don't seem to do anything different to change the outcome. Also, teaching the child to be positive towards themselves is also a really key thing in making a huge difference. So this is the end of part one of my webinar, and part two will follow very shortly.